Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Courtney. I'm Gabby Shoun. I am the Manager of Inpatient Services here at Sierra Tucson. And today's presentation is going to be on Voice the Legacy, Navigating the Loss of a Loved One to Suicide. This is actually a group that we do have here at Sierra Tucson, and it's something that I am so deeply passionate about, not only from a clinical perspective, but also from a personal perspective. Sierra Tucson is one of those really special places that really advocates for clinicians to be able to share their passions, pursue their passions, and if there's a specific need for a group or just extra support for our residents, we're really encouraged to pursue that. And that's really where Voice the Legacy came from. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Voice the Legacy is, where that name came from. But it was co-developed by myself and another amazing, talented clinician, Bryn Holt. After we started to notice a really big need for support for people who have lost a loved one to suicide. It is a really specific type of grief and a really complicated form of grief that I'll get into, definitely the specifics with that. But after we noticed that there was a need for support, we were able to start this group and to provide a safe space for those to really explore that type of grief amongst others who have shared in that. One of the biggest things right now, especially with COVID, suicide rates are really on the rise, unfortunately. And with that, for every person who does complete suicide, there's at least 6 people who have been deeply impacted by that person who are left really struggling throughout the complicated grief process. And so there really is a huge need that for that extra support. So that's really where Voice the Legacy came from. I mentioned that Voice Legacy is something that I'm deeply passionate about from both professional and personal. And I did lose my dad to suicide when I was about 13. So I'm always really careful about self-disclosure as a therapist. But in this particular setting, it's really vital to create that safe space so that everybody in the group knows that everyone has shared in that loss and, definitely doesn't understand each one's experiences fully, of course, but has shared in that type of loss, so they do have some sort of understanding. So that's really what Voice Legacy is, but let me get into the presentation, and I'm probably going to turn off my camera for right now and get into the PowerPoint, and then I'll turn it on later for questions. But like I said, thank you all for joining me, and I look forward to this. All right, so the main areas that we are going to talk about today, I'm going to talk a little bit about more about Voice the Legacy. We're going to talk about suicide and the complicated grief process, isolation within the grief process, creating community and connection, and as well as what does support look like. So let me just start off with Voice the Legacy. So I shared a little bit about what the group is, but let me get into what the goal is. So the goal of Voice the Legacy is for residents to begin to understand that they can talk about the suicide of a loved one without the fear of judgment. Residents have the opportunity to learn how to acknowledge suicide as a cause of death and also recognize that it does not have to overshadow their loved one's legacy. Residents begin to gain a deeper insight into the complicated grief process that accompanies the suicide of a loved one. So the biggest thing that I think is a takeaway from this group is the ability to establish trust and safety in talking about their loved one. I'm going to talk about stigma quite a bit throughout this presentation. But there is a huge stigma attached to suicide, and so it can be an incredibly sensitive and difficult topic for our residents to talk about, and just for people in general to talk about. many may not have even processed it at all, even in the treatment setting. We see that quite often in the group. People will say, well, I actually haven't talked about this yet, even in my process group or even with my therapist, because I just don't think that anybody will understand. So that, like I said, that trust and safety is huge, and being able to share and have the space to talk about feelings and also be able to share about their loved one, who they were, what some of their accomplishments were, what they really loved about that person. So being able to acknowledge suicide as, of course, a cause of death, we really talk about not wanting to gloss over that fact, but yet also talk about the opposite side too. Yes, they did complete suicide, and also, hey, let me tell you about them. So having those be something that we really hone in on. So that is the main goal of Voice the Legacy. So let me jump into the complicated grief process. You're going to notice on this slide, this is what we typically refer to as the 5 stages of grief. This is Kubler-Ross's model, and it looks pretty simple. And I really want to make sure to talk about the fact that no grief process is simple. It doesn't matter what the cause of death is. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. All forms of grief are incredibly difficult to navigate through. With the 5 stages of grief, it never really looks like this. It never really looks this linear as it's presented. And you're going to notice on the next slide the difference between this and complicated grief. So with these, we have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Now, let me go to the complicated grief process. This looks kind of like a mess. I'm well aware of that. In fact, as I was creating this slide, I had a couple therapists come in and say, what in the world are you doing? Why are you going to put that in your presentation? And this is actually modeled after an activity that we do with our residents in Voice the Legacy in order to create connection. So we oftentimes will say, all right, we're going to talk about the grief process, and let's just draw on the board what it's looked like for you. So we'll start asking them, all right, where do you think you're at? What are some feelings that you've had? And this is what generally comes up for it. And you'll notice that there's all kinds of feelings, and it's attached to a variety of different things. Where this creates connection is that each group member will start to see, oh, okay, I have felt anger at one point, and yet I've also felt peace, and that's okay. And they'll start to say, okay, well, I felt my anger was really from anger at society because I felt like society didn't understand, and that led to a lot of shame. And like I said, group members will really start to connect to one another and realize, wow, all of my feelings actually are valid, and there really is no set process. That's why it's the complicated grief process. There's no right or wrong way to feel, and there's really no right or wrong way to grieve. There's, with suicide, oftentimes it happens incredibly suddenly without warning, and there's a lot of shock and confusion. And so that's what really spirals these feelings. Where the grief process, the complicated grief process differs quite a bit is when there really is no movement towards the idea of acceptance. I'm also incredibly careful about talking about acceptance, and I really make the disclaimer that acceptance does not equal approval. Just because you accept something does not mean that you approve that in this example that suicide happened. And acceptance is incredibly necessary in order to move on. And again, I say move on very carefully because we never want to forget the trauma that one has been through. Yet we also have to talk about what does life look like now? How can we adjust to live our best life moving forward? So that is the complicated grief process in a nutshell. And I'm going to move on to the idea of isolation within this process. I mentioned before, there's a huge stigma and a lot of shame attached to loss from suicide. And it can be for a variety of different reasons. It can be from societal views on suicide. There's a lot of cultural and religious components to that. For example, we have a lot of group members that will often talk about the idea that their loved one never had a funeral because of religious reasons, or family members really just don't even acknowledge suicide as a cause of death, so they really never were able to actually grieve their loved one. I've had residents say, like, all right, this happened 30 years ago, and I actually never really talked about it, so it just kind of was something we swept under the rug. So that lack of understanding and support can really lead to a lot of feelings of shame and difficulty talking about their loved one. So that's really what we're targeting in Voice the Legacy, is acknowledging those aspects of the grief process and starting to slowly break down those barriers and say, okay, we can talk about this. It is okay. A lot of the lack of understanding, I do want to mention this, is that it can lead to people just not knowing what to say, and so therefore just not saying anything at all. So that support can technically be there, but it's not felt by the person who has lost that loved one. So it can lead to a lot of feelings of loneliness. Anger and blame is a huge piece of this process as well. Anger, I really, really want to highlight this. Anger is a healthy emotion. And with that said, there's a little bit of a difference between healthy anger, so anger at the situation, angry at the loss, and then anger rooted in shame, which can turn to blame and resentment, which I'll get to in a second. On this slide, it says that there's many different forms of anger. With suicide, it's very different because oftentimes the anger is actually towards the loved one, which can create a lot of different feelings. And also anger towards self, which can ultimately lead to blame. A lot of people blame themselves. We see a lot of that in groups. And talking about blame is a huge piece as well. Let me go back. Blame is a huge piece as well, because this blame, we're looking for some sort of sense of control, and so that's really where the blame can come from. So if the blame is towards ourselves, we really start to engage in the what ifs. What if I had just done X, Y, and Z? That person would still be there. That can really keep us stuck. And in the family system, it can really break down that as well, because it can lead to blame within the family, which can really start to tear families apart, unfortunately. So moving on to guilt, I talked about the what if, and I mentioned the idea of, okay, what if I had been more supportive? What if I had been a better parent? Would that have changed anything? So then that really leads to a lot of guilt. And this is something that's actually really interesting that I didn't realize would actually be a part of the group. And it's talked about almost in every single group that we have. And that's the guilt regarding having similar thoughts. And so our group members will often talk about the idea of knowing the impact of a loss to suicide and also struggling with suicidal ideation themselves. And that piece is so interesting because it really, really creates an isolating component to it, because it's hard to talk about. It's hard to talk about a loved one and also feel that guilt. But where it really becomes, I keep mentioning the word interesting, where it really becomes interesting and incredibly powerful is that's where a ton of connection really occurs amongst the group, because others can share, yes, I have been there too. And we talk a lot about the idea of tunnel vision. And our group members will share, especially if they've struggled with suicidal ideation themselves, So really talk about that idea of tunnel vision. In that moment, you're not thinking about what's going to come from this loss to suicide. You're going to be really considering just ending that pain that you're in that moment. And so what we've seen, and I'll use a specific example, we had a mother who lost her son, and she was really struggling with that idea of, hey, what if I had been a better parent? What if I had been a more supportive mother? What could have happened? Could I have saved him? And we had another member in the group who he too had lost a loved one to suicide. And he had also struggled with suicidal ideation himself. And he let her know, hey, you know what? When I was in that space, I wasn't thinking about anything. I was not thinking about my parents. I was not thinking about my friends. That did not occur to me in the slightest. All I wanted to do was just end my pain in that moment. And it really helped that other group member, that mother, gain perspective on her own guilt. And, we can tell people all day long, hey, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. And in order for it to really sink in, sometimes it's necessary to hear it from somebody who's actually been there. And that's where that group supportive environment is so incredibly beneficial and so vital. With that idea, this is a lot of what I just went into a little bit. That idea of community and connection and why it's so important. I mentioned that idea of creating that connection and having others know, hey, I've been there as well. It decreases the feelings of loneliness. The loss of a loved one to suicide can be incredibly lonely because we feel like, all right, no one can understand. No one will understand, so I'm just not going to talk about it. And I really always refer to that as suffering in silence, because there's a lot of suffering with losing a loved one to suicide, and not being able to share about it can be really, really a difficult process. It decreases shame. So one thing we talk about a lot in group as well is that idea of, hey, we've been there and we can talk about the loved one without the fear of judgment. Voice Legacy is a no judgment zone. We can talk about anything and everything, and it's okay. And so in Voice the Legacy, we kind of jump from all kinds of feelings throughout the group. We laugh, we tell stories, and also just create a space we always refer to it as just be, a space to just be and be able to share and talk if you want to talk. You don't have to talk too. Sometimes just sitting amongst others who have shared a similar type of grief can be incredibly impactful. So it may, just kind of open the door to say, hey, when I'm ready, I'll be able to talk about it. And that's okay too. Again, grief is not on a timeline. So that's a really important aspect of this too. All right, what does support look like? So you may be wondering, if I have not shared in this type of grief, how do I support a loved one? What does that look like? If you're a clinician, how do I support my patients, my clients? What is that going to entail? You'll notice that this is a very simple slide. We'll do this as an activity in group as well, and just talking about what do you need for support. The biggest things that we notice and that are mentioned are the idea of patience and the idea of just listening. Patience with that, just knowing that all feelings are valid and that there's no right or wrong way to grieve. Not really expecting someone to move on or to grieve on a timeline. There is no timeline in the grief process. I know I've said that a couple different times, but there really isn't. With that listening piece, simply holding space. If someone wants to share a story or wants to share about their loved one, going back to the idea of just listening, just being there. And that can really open the door. There is no, when I talk about grief, the complicated grief process and losing a loved one to suicide, when I talk about it as a really isolating experience, I mentioned the fact that a lot of people want to support, they just don't know exactly what to say, and there's fear of saying the wrong thing. There really, I say this hesitantly because there are technically things that probably wouldn't be incredibly helpful to say, yet just simply saying, hey, I'm here for you. That's all that's needed. You don't need to solve anything. You don't need to share the most enlightening thoughts or advice. You don't need to give advice. Just simply just being there and holding space is one of the most impactful things that you can do. So as I kind of wrap this part up, I want to get to some questions. I want to make sure that we have time for that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera back on so you can see me. And hopefully that works. All right. Hello. One of the questions here is, what advice would you give to mental health professionals to struggle with guilt regarding losing a loved one to suicide and having the knowledge of how to help others who struggle with suicidal ideation? So with that, with struggling with the guilt piece, that's really a tough one because like I mentioned, it's very easy to sit there and say, hey, it wasn't your fault. There's nothing that you could have done. I mentioned the importance of having maybe a peer say it as well, but we've had group members say, I just needed to hear it in this context and hear that with the idea of suicidal ideation, just talking about that tunnel vision is a huge piece of it. Knowing that, I don't want to speak for everybody, but knowing that when someone is contemplating completing suicide, they're not thinking of their loved ones. They're just simply thinking of ending that pain. So really, just kind of honing in on that can be really, really helpful. And I think also recognizing that guilt is valid. Guilt is a feeling as well. It doesn't have to be something that we say, all right, this needs to go away right now in order for you to move on. We can acknowledge that the guilt is there and say, you can't that guilt, you can hold that, yet what can you do to help you be able to continue on with your life and live your best life? This is an interesting question. So how to address let me get that going. Can you facilitate a group if you have not experienced the loss of a loved one to suicide? I think yes. I think it does create a different dynamic for sure if you have experienced that loss. But really, the biggest takeaway from this and from leading a group with regarding this topic is just simply holding space. So if you can hold space and allow the group members to connect and share, then absolutely it can be a really impactful group. It does, like I said, create a different dynamic if you have yourself lost someone, because being able to have that bit of self-disclosure can just open things up a little bit more. We've done groups where we have not shared that piece, and the groups still go fine. It's just it definitely can go a little bit deeper if there is that. So I'm going to answer one more question and then I'm going to wrap things up. And the question is, could you elaborate on how acceptance does not mean approval? Yes, absolutely. I'm a DBT clinician through and through. I love DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. And a huge part of DBT is acknowledging that piece of acceptance. And you can accept something and recognize that if you do accept something, it does not mean that you condone it. It does not mean that it's something that you're like, all right, I'm totally fine with this. Now I can move on. Not in the slightest. Acceptance just opens the door to that idea of adjusting to this new reality and being able to form new relationships, to be able to exist in your life, and know that it is okay to live your life, and to like I mentioned, I keep saying that word adjust, but it really is a huge adjustment. And so I hope that answers your question a little bit. Acceptance does not have to mean that you approve of the fact that you lost your loved one. It just means that it's your ability to live your best life. So I apologize if there's any questions I did not get to, but I really want to thank you all for joining me. This is such a experience that I'm so grateful to have had. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.